Henry Kissinger
Oh,
made a trip to Beijing, and he met with Wang Yi. He met with Xi Jinping. He was at a famous state guest hotel, the site of the so-called secret meeting in 71 and 72 that led to the eventual normalization 7 years later, the official normalization at least. And he was welcomed in China with open arms. There was a lot of warm feelings exchanged between the two. He's 100 years old. And so there was a lot of discussion about just what it means for him to have visited China 100 times, him being 100 years old. And there was a pretty big, stark message sent. And you wrote a column about this, which I'll also pull up and then, of course, share in the chat about this. So, in your estimation, what was this all about? Because you talk about in the column a brewing neocon-led, U.S.-led war on China, and this was not received well. John Kirby, spokesperson of the National Security Council of the United States, he called Henry Kissinger, this was really interesting to me, a private citizen who was able to meet with defense officials, with Li Shangfu, and of course with the rest of the Chinese brass, and they're not able to. They don't mention the sanctions, of course, on Li Shangfu. But your take on this development, Pepe?
Wow, this column was, I was told that everybody in the Beltway read this column because it was reprinted by Zero Hedge. And it was on Un's review as well. And it was reprinted by Zero Hedge. It was originally published, I originally published at Sputnik, and it went all over the place. Because especially my key point, which was something that I had discussed before with some, let's say, good players, is that what really happened was an interview that came out simultaneously with the Kissinger's visit to China. Kissinger is seen by the Politburo, by Xi himself, by the Chinese leadership as an old friend of China. You have no idea what that means in the Chinese context. It's immensely important. This means that they trust you. This means that you are considered a friend of the Chinese nation and the Chinese people. And for all that Kissinger has done, and now we could have a massive conversation about that, all his war criminal past.
Yes.
And I would say a very mediocre book that he wrote about China, on China, which I read back to back, and I was not impressed with anything. At least in China, he is respected. So this is taken into consideration by everybody who practices realpolitik. This does not mean that the visit was influential or it changed anything. Kissinger was basically telling Xi, Wang Yi, and the Politburo what they already know, that we have to do everything to basically save the China-US relationship, which is being derailed by a bunch of crazies. Obviously, Kissinger didn't spell it out, but the Chinese know exactly who we're talking about. And one of these crazies happened to have an interview exactly the same week, Edward Luttwak. And it was very funny because I discussed this with people who know Edward very well in Italy. Edward visits Italy often. And I met him, but not in Italy. I met Edward in Kazakhstan. That's another long story. So all of us knew Edward, and the Italians were telling me in detail, oh, every time Edward shows up here or in Rome, something major happens. And it's usually bad for Italy. So, and it's a fact that Edward is arguably the most influential Pentagon advisor for the past 50 years or so. He is very well informed. He's very dangerous. And when he says or he doesn't say something, which is a lot in this interview, what he doesn't say comes from, I would say, the deepest recesses of the real deep state. And basically his message was, at the beginning I was astonished because he was actually spelling it out. Edward was saying that William Burns, head of the CIA, actually picked up the phone and called Sergei Narishkin, head of Russian foreign intelligence, and told him, look, Biden and Putin are going to make a deal. Now, he was telling Narishkin that. He was not listening to Narishkin. He was basically telling Narishkin that there's got to be a deal and Biden wants to do a deal. Because we have other fish to fry, essentially, which is the war against China. Obviously, he didn't say anything about what Narishkin replied, of course, and the tone of their conversation. And this is something for us foreigners to learn in Moscow. It's practically impossible. So for the moment, you only have his version. We won't have a version from Narishkin. And then he jumped right into the meat of the matter, which was to say, the war that really matters is already on. It's a war against China, and China will lose the war. His own word, I'm quoting him. And China will lose it. His own words. You can check the interview yourselves, all of you. Because China doesn't know how to fight, because for a number of reasons. So this was an astonishing interview because the real fact during that week was not the Kissinger visit, it was this interview by Edward. And, the carefully selected to a very well informed and polite British interviewer, but it's an absolute bombshell, And most people in the U.S., when they haven't even heard about the interview. They start tuning in after my column. It was very, very fun. That was very, very funny. But not funny when you think about the tenor and the subject and what Edward was saying. This is extremely dangerous. These people, the Straussian neocon cycles, their acolytes, their epigons, and the people who actually influence them. Edward actually is on a different level. He influences these people. He's not influenced by them. It's a completely different relationship. They are actually convinced, and they have already embarked on the war against China narrative. And then this week, just another example, the American Enterprise Institute, two of their hacks, they published a piece, a long piece, by the way, on foreign policy, if I'm not mistaken, saying that de-risking in terms of trade against China is not enough. We need a complete break, which basically is coded language for total war against China. So, yes, Danny, you are laughing, and I'm sure all of you watching may be laughing, but we should be extremely worried because these people, especially now that they are on extra deranged mode, they are capable of anything. They are facing the utter humiliation of NATO in Ukraine, which is now graphic, not only for the global South, but even for Americans who have a brain, right? The best military analysts around writing in English, like Martyanov, like Colonel McGregor, like Scott Ritter, etc. Everybody has been saying that's it. It's over. We just need to know the exact date when it's going to be over. It's over. That's it. So what's going to be? The Americans are going to pick up the phone and call the Russians and say, look, we need a ceasefire, a truce, a freeze, or no, they won't. Tony Blinken every week says the same thing. We're going all the way. And at the same time, the mainstream media narrative has already changed. It's now sidelining Ukraine. It's now it's a take that is equivalent to throwing Zelensky under the bus, sort of, to the real wars against China. And what Edwards' interview did was to solidify this position. And that's why it's so dangerous. So obviously Kissinger's visit compared to it simply disappeared in the end. And I'm sure realpolitik practitioners in the US, they noticed that. And now they're even more worried than they were a week ago.
Yeah, I mean it is very serious. You're exactly correct. This is happening. I mean, I was just in China, and it's people would talk about both the consequences of the economic so-called de-risking, the sanctions, and
De-risking.
all of this. And there are consequences, but certainly there's also a lot of confidence about where things are going for China, and not a lot of fear so much as it is a concern for the other side and then what it will mean for the world. And I think, I got a lot of people in the US. You mentioned Kissinger's war criminality. Are they, how could China do this? How could China do this? And I said, this is real politics. This is a message. This is a message being sent about what China exactly wants. And it's been a very clear message from the very beginning. And this was really what I felt was like a reenactment. Hey, this has happened before. We can do this. Can you do this? Can you
Yeah.
Step off the brink of the most dangerous conflict that might jump off in maybe the history of geopolitics, and use what little left of your rational brain may exist in this moment among the neocons. But I'm wondering if you could talk more about with China, this war that people like Litwick and others, especially in the foreign policy establishment, are contemplating. Given all that we've known has transpired with Russia and Ukraine and how that's gone for NATO and the US, the neocons, not well. With China, I mean, what is your take on this next dangerous step? Because it doesn't feel, that's some of the chuckles that I had, is it doesn't feel like it's going to go very well given what we already know. We can't necessarily predict the future, but we know what's happening now and where things may go. So how do you think things will go between the US and China from here, given the march to war is occurring? And how will that,
Well,
how do you think that will go
I'm
for them?
part of a fascinating discussion group with lots of ultra well informed and well educated Chinese scholars. So I learn from them all the time. And of course, there's bits and pieces of what's being discussed inside China and among the Chinese diaspora across Asia, of course, what we call the bamboo internet, and Chinese Americans as well. Basically, they say, okay, a bunch of barbarians, let them come. We're ready. Anytime they want, we're ready. Of course, this is coming from those who have studied at least 3,000 years of diplomacy. Of course, we have to respect them. But when they give examples, practical examples of what could happen if the U.S. decides to up the ante, of course, they're right. In terms of Chinese defenses, in terms of the carrier killers that they have all along the coastline, in terms of retaliatory measures, and in terms of basically, they will. The Chinese could dissuade the Americans from a military adventure even before the Americans start one, which is what this is going to happen. It's going to be essentially a false flag, Gulf of Tonkin style, to create the conditions for an American attack against China centered on Taiwan. The Chinese have studied all the procedures false flag related, and also they studied what the Russians study about it as well. So they are prepared, they're ready, and this is how Edward didn't understand and completely misinterpreted what Xi Jinping said about a month ago. Let's get ready for war. Basically, Xi Jinping was saying we need to be prepared for war because we know it's going to come. For the moment, it's hybrid. It could become hot sooner or later, especially if the empire is too desperate. And obviously, Edward didn't get it. First of all, Edward doesn't know much about China. He knows a lot about the West. He knows a lot about Byzantium. He wrote an excellent book about Byzantium military strategy, for instance, but he doesn't know much about China historically, dynastic China, and much less about contemporary China, compared to Kissinger, for instance, who is a student of China, at least, which brings me to something that I would like to ask you, Danny, personally. What echoes did you have personally when you were in China in terms of Chinese public opinion, face to face, of course, and on the Chinese net, on WeChat, on Weibo, etc., about this American narrative of our next war is a war against China?
Well, one of the conversations that really sticks out for me is I was on a delegation that was about the Global Civilization Initiative. And so one of the staffers at the Chinese Association for International Understanding that was holding the entire conference that transpired, it was a 2 day conference. And then, we were a small delegation that was taken around to 4 different cities. One of the staffers was asking me explicitly about this, and his impression first of all, his impression about the narrative is that, it's, first of all, it's insane. It's not,
Of course.
it makes, to him, it's like, it doesn't make any sense. And really there's some, just like, for him, it was just, we're pretty connected economically, and a huge understanding that this isn't going to go well for the US side. And there's a lot of awareness about what's happening domestically in the United States. Everyone is following very closely how these leaders behave, in particular Joe Biden. I mean, I would say there's a lot of discontent with Joe Biden. The idea that this isn't always well known. I'm sure Pepe, out in the collective West, there's a lot of people who think China loves people like Joe Biden and the Democrats. That's not the feeling I got. I got a lot of, this guy is not only incompetent, but he's incredibly dangerous because he's taken things further than what Trump has done or had done, and during his administration, what his administration was responsible for. So a lot of the conversation is about how, from staffers that I spoke to, people that I spoke to, is this is nuts. Like, at the basic level, this is dangerous. This is nuts. The fear is not so much that China can't handle it. It's more so what is going to be the broader impact of it all, especially on the United States. I mean, I got a lot of sympathy. Like, I was like, oh, you poor American. Like, you're in this situation where you are being, like, led astray, and of course a lot of appreciation, because to be honest, one of the most stark things you recognize now going to China is how bad relations really are. I was the only person from the United States who came from the United States. There was one other person, I think, out of 400 plus attendees at the conference, who has lived in China for years and years and years and years and years, from the US, teaches, he's a professor. But I was the only person who was there from the US, coming from there. The people-to-people exchanges are absolutely, the ties have been severed because of the United States. And then, of course, the fact is that there's not a lot of planes, there's not a lot of flights, there's not a lot of demand. It's very costly. It's a big problem. And so even just being there as someone from the United States was almost like a surprise. Like, okay,
did you fly direct, or did you go through Hong Kong?
So on the way there, I flew to Dubai, and then that was my stopping point. And then on the way back, it was direct. And one of the really interesting things that we could also move on to, because I know you want to talk about the DPRK Russia-China meeting, is on the way back, there was this wonderful documentary, a 10-part series. I mean, it's the month of July, the celebration was coming up, a 10-part series. I couldn't watch it because it was not in English subtitles, and I do not have fluent grasp of Mandarin at all. So, but it was really interesting to see that it was Chinese. It was just for Chinese people coming back and forth from a flight Shanghai to the New York City. I mean, for me, what was so interesting was the way people spoke about politics, even just from 2019, was a lot different. It was less so like, I felt like the attitude was a lot different, that there was just, there's a better understanding of these dangers, and also just like this is how it is. And while it's really bad and we don't want it like this, like, we're prepared to do whatever it takes. Like, that's why I didn't sense any fear, any like, okay, what are we going to do? Panic. No, nobody expresses that. There's not 1 ounce of confidence from my last trip to this one lost.
Because,
but the
Chinese
awareness of the
media
dangers
explains this
way
very
high.
well. No?
Yes,
They are doing
way
a good
high.
job of explaining the madness in Washington.
Totally.
So I'm sure people who follow everything, the papers and CCTV or CGTN, they have a pretty good, and the debates are very thorough.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
the Chinese population is relatively well informed of what the Americans are going through, in fact, or
Yeah. Yeah.
subjected to
Definitely.
this Straussian neocon cycles. That's true.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That's been that was the feeling, and of course with regular ordinary people, it's more so like why do this? No, this seems to be counterproductive. It's like very basic, but among the people, the higher level that I got, even just staffers, young.
I'm very,
Some of these were just
I'm
young
very
party
curious,
members,
Danny.
and
I'm
they
very
were
curious.
just.
What was your personal impression of Shanghai?
Oh, well, Shanghai was beautiful. It's too humid, like way too. I mean, it's beautiful, it's humid, well developed. Interesting to see some of the tensions, though. Like there are, because Shanghai does have this long history pre 1949. It's interesting to see people not from Shanghai go to Shanghai and talk to you about it, because they have the impression of, a lot of the people that I was with are from smaller provinces, smaller cities, and smaller towns, and they they would be like, "Oh yeah, Shanghai's nice. It's a bit expensive. You can do Western shopping." Like they thought that's what we were into. But my impression was actually that there is, I feel like, the impetus on understanding the importance of developing that city into a truly Chinese city, and one that is modern and can really lead the way in addressing some of the, I think it has probably the most contradictions from like opening up and reform. So there was a lot of emphasis on, we got to address these things so that we can truly become the strong country that we want to be by 2050. And so that was really interesting, but also hearing Chinese people talk about Shanghainese, and like hearing about the opinions about the differences and how people think there versus maybe outside. And one person told me,
one of the capitals of the 21st century.
Oh my gosh, yeah,
it was Asian capital of the 21st century.
It was incredible, because you get a lot of like, oh, it's completely Western. It's not like that at all. It's, first of all, it's a really big city, so sure, you can go to the shopping districts. You could do that in any city. Go to the shopping districts and go to Zara, whatever. But no, when you go around the city, you get the sense of both the history and the modernization is just, I mean, it is incredible. It is. You get the feeling like when you're standing.
You went to Pudong, you went to the top of the Jinmao Tower, all that.
Slumless, like the slumless city. Like it is incredible, and you do see the future of modernization there, with attention to the problems. That's one thing that I think people like to push down, is like to say, oh, well, Shanghai's modern, but look at all the problems. It's like the addressing the problems is a huge part of what the Chinese people are doing. And, they're vastly overstated, but even what problems do exist, the conversation and the policy is all about address. Like, I've never been to a place so humid. I get destroyed by bugs and mosquitoes. Like, I don't know if it's my Asian blood, but they have a whole campaign.
You've been to Southeast Asia, I assume.
Just China, and
not Southeast Asia. Wow, I lived in Southeast Asia for decades, so I'm used to it.
Right? No, but in Shanghai, they have a campaign because they know that there's a huge mosquito problem. They have a citywide, party-wide campaign where every single year they control the pests, so you can go there and wear whatever you want without bug spray. Because I was telling people, I was like, oh, I really need bug spray right now. And they're like, no, you don't. I'm like, why? It's like 100 degrees. The humidity is 150%. And I'm sweating just sitting here. So I assume the mosquitoes are going to swarm me any second on the Huangpu River, whatever. Nope. Because they control these. So
they control it. Exactly.
Yeah, because they have a policy. They invest in things like, because people get sick. People get sick from that. That was a historical thing in China. So anyway, just small things like that. Definitely you see it's like, yeah, you have the modernization, the bright lights, the light shows, and then you have like what they're doing to improve the situation for all Chinese people. And it's very interesting. It is the future, like not just Shanghai, but everything. You get to see the lower tier cities, and they're trying to make everything they're elevating to the same level, and
The same level. In
that's
fact, they
not
are following.
normal
They following to the letter what Deng Xiaoping told Lee
to
Kuan
the
Yew
letter.
when he visited Singapore before the start of the opening up. He said, "For you,
Yes.
it's easier. My problem is that I have to do 1,000 Singapores, and now they're doing 1,000 Singapores. It's mind-boggling, in fact."
Yep, indeed. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.